Over the last decade or so, I've come to the realization that I think the term Skyrim Killer doesn't really help our perception of any game. In the last few months alone, we've seen both Avowed and Atomfall suffer from comparisons to Bethesda's work, and, well, we've even seen Bethesda look dull in comparison to old Bethesda. There is a real purpose to this, because the likes of Skyrim, Oblivion, and Fallout have this esteem, partially driven by, let's be honest, some nostalgia, and also by worlds that are engaging and immersive to explore. They have this just one more dungeon effect that is propped up by varied and well-placed loot, bite-sized and often compelling storytelling, and a power fantasy that makes you feel strong, but also like a small speck in a much grander universe. Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, can be compared to Skyrim in more than just scope and feel. There's a political strife key to its narrative, warring factions, and roots from turmoil that spread into every inch of the rest of the world. The fact that it's kind of a horrible world to exist in, saved only by your own agency and power as a player. To be just anyone in Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon is to risk plague, being overcome by fungus, having your heart ripped out by fae, or simply being hunted by wildlife. To live as the main character is to be a god, and one who has absolute control over everything. The power fantasy isn't just the ability to kill things, it's your desire and capacity to enact changes, swap around the cogs, and power a whole new engine. I think Skyrim Killer is a term used to set up false pretenses of the game you're playing and to talk down and diminish the time you spent in the former game. This has felt somewhat obvious for a time, but I've only really sat down to really analyse it in the wake of the launch of Tainted Grail. So from here on out, I'm dropping that Skyrim comparison and talking about the game itself. After finishing Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon, here's why I'm glad it exists, even though it's very, very messy. Before we get into it, I originally wrote in this script that we got past 1500 subscribers and had a goal set for 1600, and that was about a week and a half ago. Since then, we've flown past that and we're already at around 2300 subscribers, so instead of using this to tell you to subscribe, I'm instead just going to say thanks. It means a lot to see that people like what I'm doing, they want to support it, and there are people out there who kind of think like I do. And I normally say this at the end of videos, but not everyone gets to them, so thank you for subscribing. In a familiar start, you are a prisoner at the start of Fall of Avalon, but it soon shapes into its own thing as you discover the asylum you're trapped in houses those infected with the Red Death and left to die, either via their own sickness or the hands of those who captured them. This plague has been spreading, driving infected mad, and eventually killing them. The act to lock them up is like a more visceral and sickening version of burning corpses and making mass graves during the Black Plague, and those killing the infected are doing so in an attempt to study what's going on. When you are released from your prison cell, you too are infected with little hope until your life is inextricably linked to that of King Arthur, a cyclical spirit who wants you to reunite his relics and bring him back. When he fled to Avalon hundreds of years ago, the goal was to use his immense power to not only deal with the Red Death, but keep the weird at bay, a dark corruption that is ever spreading. Tension is met almost immediately, as the knight who just so happens to have bust you out of your cell wishes to slay King Arthur and let the land decide for itself what happens, even if that means leaving it in the hands of the Weird, the Red Death, or any number of tribes. What Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon does well is give you a backdrop that you can't fully piece together. You are left in the dark for much of the narrative, and though it goes some way to tying a bow around it all, there's a land much greater than you with stories you won't hear. It makes the world feel huge, varied, and frankly brutal. Arthurian legend, specifically the tale of Tainted Grail, feels flush with ideas and stories that make it great for an RPG, and that political strife present in the game feels explored surprisingly well, thanks to not only parallels we can draw, but beliefs that, even when appearing archaic, are attempted to be explained with some gusto. The decisions that lead you to the end and working with different camps do make sense when you consider the context its inhabitants live in. Struggling under the foot of a monarchy while the plague roams the streets is a nice parallel to England in the 1300s or, well, England in 2020. The game balances a very depressing world with just enough surrealism and fun to not feel entirely oppressive. Something I like a lot is how impractical some of the game's decisions are. One side quest has you find wood to repair a shantytown, and there's a lumbering skill for getting wood that doesn't get any more advanced than that. There's not a survival crafting mechanism here, you don't get a +1 to wood farming for doing it enough, it's just a side thing to do a side thing. Another has you blow up a floor to find a cheese wizard undead thing in the basement that teaches you a spell to turn others into cheese. The knowledge here can then be given to a chef in the last location of the game to get some extra dialogue. Tainted Grail has a fishing minigame, a sketchbook where you do a screenshot style sketch of whatever's in front of you, and the whole game has weird NPCs with intimate drama that can take you in different directions. There can be a consistency problem with some quests being better than others, but this is also just part of the problem with huge RPGs, and there's enough quality in there that I don't feel burned out. I think there's this parallel you can draw between open world RPGs and sitcoms. There's a lot of canned laughter in there, and whether it's charming or annoying is largely dependent on how many of those jokes actually land. Tainted Grail isn't quite as good as a Seinfeld, but it's not as annoying as a Big Bang Theory. I'd say quality-wise, it's closer to the former than the latter. Sorry, fans of Big Bang Theory and haters of Seinfeld for that comparison. This isn't to say there aren't any stakes. At night, the weird spreads, and if you're caught away from civilization, you will start to be slowly hunted by creatures of the weird. You can take on these enemies once you've developed the right skills or tactics, but it gives the game a Dying Light style element that made me a bit worried about not having a quick way out in the first few hours. There's a commitment to being the kind of game it wants to that I can't help but admire. You can lose an arm by petting an animal, and this locks you out of a special sword to finish a questline for the end of the game, and it means you can no longer mine for ore or dig up loot. It significantly nerfs your entire playthrough, and as far as I can see, there doesn't seem to be a way of getting this arm back. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. In fact, the rough edges of Tainted Grail feel more human. The weird parts give it character, and they're not a flaw you overlook, they're an acquired taste, like the taste of a human arm inside the jaw of a mischievous creature who has no plans to give it back. Gameplay-wise, I'd say Tainted Grail is mostly rather satisfying. There are one-handed and two-handed blunt weapons and blades, as well as bows and magic. Leveling up gives you the ability to enhance one attribute and buy one upgrade in your skill tree, which can contribute to your effectiveness, but you also have skills you level up through activity. I opted for a dual-handed mage, and though I felt a bit squishy earlier on, I soon managed to plow through enemies with little effort. Combat is satisfying with plenty of good skill upgrades at the start and fun builds. I will say though, I quickly gave up on archery as enemies felt a little too spongy. I could see that changing somewhat as you get better bows and upgrade skills, but I had more fun in other builds, so gave up pretty quickly. This spongy enemy problem does become more pressing as you get further into the game, especially as you get into the third act, but the third act actually has a lot more problems than just this. We'll get onto that a little later. Tainted Grail has quite a few problems with bugs and performance. I simply couldn't finish some quests, the prompts wouldn't come up, and the game felt a bit choppy in some areas too. This quest problem is particularly annoying because you'll have them forever stuck in your menu without the ability to tick them off. It's worth noting that bugs and performance are the most transient complaints about games, as we can never be sure they'll stick around, so consider it more a warning if you jump in now and not a fervent critique of the very being of the game. However, even if the game performed perfectly, I'd still find some problems, specifically with the third act, and even parts of the second one. Where the first area has an intriguing story, crammed with extra ideas, little nooks and crannies to explore, and Arthur in your head as a companion to give context on the story, those crannies become tiresome and Arthur mostly says nothing. The stakes of the last section of the game are higher, yet he doesn't feel the need to proselytize. Part of the reason the likes of Johnny Silverhand work so well is not only because there's a deep empathy to his betrayal, but an even deeper desperation. You never quite know when you're being manipulated, and he constantly feels like a presence even when he's not there. Arthur, on the other hand, doesn't grow, and I found little reason to actually consult him. This is a shame, as the way the game tells his story is rather intriguing even until the end of the game. His role as a leader doing bad things for what are perceived to be good outcomes sets up an empathetic villain or a flawed hero, though the endings don't actually commit to layers of ambiguity that the game hints at but never fully moves in favour of. There's an implied greyness at points, and one I think the narrative could benefit from exploring more. As well as this, enemy design loses focus, and these big, bad creatures you read and hear about instead feel placid and static. Their fury and their history don't come through in a character that just sort of swings its arms for a few minutes until you get through its rather large health bar. There's this thing J.J. Abrams talks about sometimes. He says the key to intrigue at the heart of some of his stories is a conceptual box you unravel as you watch. The mystery is the story rather than a tool to get to the end. It wraps one problem in another, and then another. Mysteries are additive, and the goal for the TV show slash movie slash game in this case is to keep unwrapping. After all of this, the intent should be for your answer to link to these layers. Shows like Lost are infamous for using it, skirting from week to week on ideas that don't make sense, but deliberately so. Also, like Lost, this technique can lead to a place that you struggle to write yourself out of and can't pay off all that wasted time. Tainted Grail isn't exactly doing the mystery box, but I think part of the problem with its third act is there's this build up throughout the game that the latter half fails to live up to. I found myself just wishing I was on to the next part a handful of times throughout the last few quests, and what I saw when I got there was a second to last final boss that could be defeated by gently strafing as I fired electricity for a handful of minutes. The latter half of the game shows how superfluous the skill tree feels once you purchase the 15 or so skills you actually want. Side activities start to feel less varied, and the world feels less fun to peel back. Everything falls into a rhythm cemented 15 hours prior, but not quite a steady one, and an oddly slow one at that. And this is all done with a quest system that feels like it struggles to actually handle the latter parts of the game. You are regularly sent to the wrong place or given side objectives to do certain activities that aren't actually in your quest log. I could believe this is intentional, but it's not treated as a secret option, it's just part of how you finish a quest. The elements I enjoyed the most in the first 10 or so hours were exploring and figuring out how the world works, and the last act feels like it never really innovates from there. It's less evocative, less interesting, and less polished. It's quite a front-loaded game with the inertia of that first act carrying you through to the end. One important quest has you use a special sword specifically designed to take on a certain boss, which is neat conceptually but weak mechanically given how much you are encouraged to commit to a build. It's quite an easy boss, which I imagine is due to this limitation. My two-handed skill was going up after pretty much every swing in this boss fight due to how low my skill is and how much comparable damage I was doing. Despite its problems, there's a self-confidence here I adore. The R meeting I mentioned before is part of that, but it's not the only place it does so. The way the narrative weaves in other names from Arthurian legends is brave in a sense, as it feels like they're there to enhance the story and not name drop willy-nilly because you recognize them. Characters take on the role they should for the story it's telling. It's a very exploitable game, and one I'd argue is doing so intentionally. Should you choose to, you can farm for a bunch of money, use that on certain items, use those items to craft a lot, and suddenly see a skill hit level 100. I've made close to 100,000 coins off a single stack of items, and it feels like you're really encouraged to just throw yourself off buildings to increase athletics and punch bears to level up your hand-to-hand combat. More importantly, Tainted Grail feels like a great popcorn game. I think this summation could be read as denigrative, but it's not my intent. Tainted Grail conjures an atmosphere that makes it good to explore after 30 hours and still fun to clear out bandits. I said I'd drop the Skyrim comparisons, but what I actually meant is I'd drop them for most of the rest of the video because I'd like to come back to that once more here. Tainted Grail feels like it wears its Skyrim influence on its sleeve, except it has a built-in bug report and unstuck button. It's been built alongside its community for some time, and I've seen some complain, I'd argue fairly, that the last act, which is the one the game came out of early access for, is much worse than the first. However, its Skyrim-like aim is ambitious and almost wildly so. This feels like a much smaller game than Bethesda's ilk, but I also think making it bigger would actually detract from the end vision. Tainted Grail is like Skyrim in its ability to make you say, wow, I'm really off track now, and it doesn't make you feel like you're doing something wrong by finishing off that one last side quest before finally getting around to the main story. In one area, I went in by falling down a hole with an adjacent waterfall, completed a questline, then went to go back out and couldn't get out. Clicking unstuck didn't fix it, so I googled how to get out, and it turns out you have to swim in the water and click on the waterfall. It's never been established that you can climb directly up waterfalls, and you don't actually come in via that waterfall. Googling around a problem is a semi-frequent response for me here. Welcome back, Bethesda. Despite its problems, Tainted Grail is a fun time in a unique world and a project that I was sort of astounded by. The idea of a team deciding we're going to do Skyrim and at least partially successfully doing so is wonderful. I love the passion on display there and the hubris of it at the same time. And this is where I end up, even after finding significant parts of the end of the game to be a bit of a slog. It's a game I really don't mind whisking me off into another cave, and it's a world that made me enjoy peeling the layers of that mystery box, even if those layers couldn't fully wrap together the whole package. Thank you for watching my video on Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon. This was a weird one to review, and also a script I've had written up for a little while. I think other things have just come through and changed my focus, so I'm glad to finally get back to it. I'm genuinely incredibly surprised by how much growth has happened on the channel in the last month and a half. Basically, ever since the middle of June, we've just had record-breaking videos, which I just can't believe. My peak video is now over 40,000 views, which honestly didn't think I'd ever get. So thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you happen to have watched my peak video and now have come here, let me know. That would be really lovely to hear. Anyway, if you played Tainted Grail, what did you think? Did you find the same problems with it? Did you enjoy the parts I did? If you liked the video, please subscribe. It really helps me out and it encourages me to keep going, keep getting my thoughts out there, and try to wrap my head around some of the things going on in gaming right now. I have a couple of cool interviews I've done recently that I think will make into videos, but they might take a while because I need to do a lot of back and forth. Either way, I'm being cryptic, so I'll stop that. If you like this, please subscribe. It really, really helps me out, and thank you so much for watching.